F1 has shocked the world with their latest statement yet again after they've signed the trademarks of yet another street circuit in what would be the fourth race in the USA. After the fans and the drivers have all expressed their anger with the increasing trend of expanding the calendar on circuits in which the cars are not suited to drive, the sport doesn't really seem to care that much when money is in question. But with NASCAR posing the biggest threat to F1's street race in Chicago, will the city be forced to choose one over the other? And is this the ultimate showdown as to which sport could generate more money for the community? It's safe to say that Formula One is blindly following a trend of expansion, one that the fans and the drivers are not too fond of, but one that has brought millions of dollars in extra revenue for all the teams. With this in mind, the Catalunya GP has been put in a lot of jeopardy after F1 officially signed the contract with Madrid to host the Spanish GP from 2026 onwards. And one of the musts on the contract is for the track to sign a minimum 10-year deal with the sport. This is something that could break the deal between Formula One and Chicago, but so far it seems like the sport is slowly but surely moving towards making this scenario happen and snatching the street circuit in front of NASCAR's eyes. One thing that has kept everyone on their toes is the fact that Formula One has signed the trademarks for a potential Chicago race, as the potential names for the race would be Chicago Grand Prix, Grand Prix of Chicago, Formula One Chicago Grand Prix, and Formula One Grand Prix of Chicago. Before we take this matter into further explanation, I should remind you guys that filling out a trademark is, of course, definitely not equal to signing a contract with a certain track. It's just the fact that if F1 were to host a race in Chicago, they would much rather have certain names protected due to the eligibility of the sport and its freedom to choose one of these names if a deal does go through. For example, the sport has also chosen a couple of trademark names for a potential New York race, but of course that deal has yet to reach the heights of the original hype that was built up around it. Nonetheless, Chicago is one of the largest cities in the USA, and a potential street circuit there would boost the revenue of the sport as well as its popularity to unseen heights. We must also not forget that one of F1's fiercest competitors in the USA, NASCAR, has opted out to race in a very unconventional way on the streets of Chicago, and while the race was heavily criticised before it was held, it brought some huge momentum to the sport. When talking about this matter, the renowned newspaper The Drive reported, if there is a Chicago Grand Prix, it won't happen until 2025 at the absolute earliest, as the 2024 season calendar is already set. If it does happen, it will be interesting to see if F1 replaces one of the existing United States races. There are currently the US GP in Austin, the Las Vegas GP, and the Miami GP, or if Chicago would be added to the calendar. The latter would give the US 4 different races, by far and away more than any other country. However, there haven't been any public discussions between F1 and the city of Chicago, so at least for the moment, this is just a preemptive trademark filling. This also wouldn't be the first street race through Chicago, as NASCAR held one last year and will be doing so again in 2024. Now, the question that all of you probably have in your head is, how in the world will F1 race on what could possibly be a 26-race calendar? To top that off, the caravan needs to visit all of the continents of the world, minus Antarctica and Africa. So if they go to Chicago, one thing they would have to pay huge attention to is the weather. The freezing winters as well as the scorching summers would be an absolute no-go for this race, especially due to its nature, where the streets would suffer the most from both of the circumstances created by the weather. And this is a topic that has also been discussed by Chicago's officials. And when reporting on this, Chicago Sun-Times alderman Brian Hopkins went on to say that so far the biggest hurdle is the length of the contract, as F1 does seem to mean serious business when it comes to the presence of these street circuits in the foreseeable future. Hopkins added, "I'm told that F1 typically requires a 10-year minimum deal, and that appears to be non-negotiable. The conversation with the city city did not get much past that. Another massive hurdle for a potential Chicago race is the costs that the city would have to take from taxpayers in order to organise the entire event. Unlike Formula One, NASCAR's costs are far more sustainable, and from the initial success that the Windy City has seen with its own racing competition, it's very unlikely that we're going to see both of the races being held in the same year. This is also something that has been reported by Hopkins, who added, "What we did with NASCAR, welding manhole covers and smoothing over potholes and calling it a track, that doesn't work with F1. More complicated, thus higher price tag." The last thing that the sport needs right now after the manhole scandal in Las Vegas is to have another race in which they would absolutely destroy the weekend of the driver, just for them to go and not map out the entire track as it should be mapped out. With this in mind, could Chicago pose a serious threat to the already existing tracks, especially the most legendary ones like Suzuka and Spa? Apart from Chicago, F1 does not seem to stop anywhere near soon when it comes to expanding its calendar on street circuits, as the latest rumour has been going around that Osaka, another legendary city in Japan, has very high potential to replace one of the most iconic races on the calendar, Suzuka. The officials there, more precisely the Bureau of Tourism, have already held talks about potentially moving the Japanese GP to Osaka in what would be yet another street circuit, as the officials have confirmed that they're now looking into potential investors to make this happen. Obviously, the new pattern of expanding into street circuits is vastly backed up by investors who are going to receive much more TV time and will be able to promote their products and services to a greater extent in these venues compared to, for example, Spa or Suzuka, where the nature of the track is purely focused on racing, which is how it should be in the first place. But with the increased popularity of the sport in the USA, it was already known that the interest would be very high to add new tracks to the calendar. It's just the fact that Miami and Las Vegas already have 10-year contracts, and if Chicago is added from 2025 onwards, one thing is for sure, F1 drivers won't be happy about visiting 25 or 26 venues in a year. Any potential addition to a new track holds its own threat, which is deleting another track from its existence. The case with the Chicago GP is very unique because it doesn't necessarily hold a race that it could replace, regardless of whether or not the move would be justified. For example, the Madrid GP would replace Catalunya if the Barcelona track was to be dropped from the calendar, and the Osaka street circuit would come in place for Suzuka, even though this is the last thing that the F1 fans would want. Be that as it may, it's a trend that we have to accept, and it's a trend that has brought a tremendous number of new fans to the sport. But for Chicago street circuit, the challenges are going to be extremely high. This is also a very big test for the USA, considering the fact they hosted a street circuit for NASCAR, and if they chose to let F1 race there, it would inevitably be damaging for the All-Americans Racing Championship. Nonetheless, it's not just the costs of organising the event that are worrying the entire city of Chicago, it's the fact that maybe we're pushing our imagination to boundaries that are not very likely to be achieved due to the physical nature of the cars and the street. Be that as it may, what do you think about a potential street race in Chicago? Let us know what you think in the comments below.